Imagine that one day you open your eyes and find yourself tied to a chair in a room that resembles a classified government facility. The environment is filled with pulsating vibrations and a metallic smell that is slowly making you dizzy. On the wall, there is a ticking clock that appears to be synced with the vibrations, almost like something is about to go off, snap, or even break. Before you could process if it's a nightmare or reality, an announcement blares through the speakers in that room.
This planet is about to explode. Either press the red button in front of you or risk your death.
Shortly after, a man inserted a card and entered the room along with his associates. Dressed in lab coats and speaking with conviction, they ask you to press a red button on the instrument panel.
The system calibrated itself as it scanned your eyes. It is good to go. All it needs is a deliberate action from your side. Do it, for humanity's last hope is you,
said the trio who appeared like scientists.
No, it's not,
shouted another voice in the room. A shabby, unkempt man comes to light.
The system is ready because your eye scans have been hacked to calibrate this machine,
said the shabby man in a dreadful voice.
That is not possible.
The scientist interjected.
What do you think the scanner is for then?
The scanner is a dummy. This machine is a part of an experiment on the entire humanity itself. Just think, if you had a choice, why would they even tie you up?
Questioned the shabby man. The scientists wearing the lab coat reply.
We tied you because the machine requires stress-induced verification. Leaving you untied would not even calibrate the machine. Look, there is not much time. Once that timer runs out, you will lose consciousness and everyone, including us, will perish.
On the wall, the timer now read 18, 17, 16. You feel dizzier and more unsettled.
Do it,
says the expert standing firmly with conviction. The timer now reads 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What do you think you are going to do? Would you leave the button unpressed or yield to the firm conviction of the professionals? The truth is, most people will give in to the feeling of dreadful anticipation. Due to that, they are most likely to trust the professionals and press the button. If you belong to the majority, let me tell you, you will be dead. Yes, now you are wondering, how is that possible? Well, that's because the psychological conditions in this thought experiment closely mirrors that of the Challenger disaster. Similar to the authorities wearing lab coats versus the shabby man, the Challenger disaster also reflects an interplay of irrefutable high authority versus dispensable low authority. The high authority being NASA, while the group with lower authority being Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Both parties found themselves scratching their heads about the safety of the launch. The engineers at Morton Thiokol warned the top management about a possible malfunction of a part due to the cold weather. But despite their warnings, NASA refuted their claims, stating that Morton Thiokol lacked enough proof to back their claims. Ultimately, the engineers at Morton Thiokol were silenced due to the overpowering stature of NASA scientists. However, what finally prevailed wasn't NASA's stature, but the hard and objective truth by the engineers of Morton Thiokol. Sadly, it was too late by then. This wasn't just technical oversight, it was a psychological trap, one where the weight of authority overpowered reason, a phenomenon known as authority bias. Authority bias deludes people to accept information without evaluating the content only because it comes from someone with authority. Despite how hard someone may try, everyone has a natural tendency to fall for this bias. Authority bias in high-stakes situations like these can bring massive setbacks, loss of money, and lives. However, you do not need high-stakes situations or ticking clocks or even project deadlines to fall for this bias. This is because we are all drowning in this bias every day. How? We are going to answer that, but before we do so, we must first understand why authority bias arises in the first place. Complying to authority figures is hardwired into our brains. Because we evolved in a hierarchical society, leaders and authority figures within these societies gave us multiple advantages. These advantages were protection, moral and emotional support, and an overall sense of belonging to the community. Slowly, this became the way of life, and so did our obligation to authority figures. From there on, it seemed to have carried on through generations. In fact, the way human life is structured, the fact that we are born into intellectual and physical dependence further develops this tendency. It becomes hardwired into our very nature, pretty much like an animal that remained on leash for a long period of time and has become used to it. You may find this comparison a little unsettling, but this tendency often cripples our growth unless we choose to take risks and explore life by ourselves. Something that gives you the confidence to face challenges and stand firm in front of authorities without fear or submission. Something that won't make you go silent in front of the so-called experts. But even if you decide to part ways from this dependence, it is not going to be easy to do so. Because as you go deeper into this problem, you see that the tendency to go silent and speechless is rooted within your mental makeup. When we say mental makeup, we are referring to nothing but the way our mind functions. The natural way it tends to distinguish between good and bad. And the first line of tools we employ is the value of appearance and perception. In the thought experiment, the appearance and demeanor of the two parties plays a crucial role. People are more likely to flag the desperation of the shabby man, but on the other hand, they are likely to positively respond to the confident tone of the trio. Additionally, the shabby appearance does not stand a chance against the neat and tidy lab coats of the professionals. This is mainly due to our past experience with doctors that is defined by trust and reliability in most cases. We cannot help but associate the lab coat with a doctor or researcher and the trust it represents at a cognitive level. In fact, for products where perceived trust becomes a major driver of sales, experts wearing lab coats becomes a common sight in promotions and advertisements. Even in the Challenger disaster, NASA's favorable perception of their own achievements played a big part in creating the critical chain of events. Because NASA never had a problem with previous launches, they thought this would play out just fine until it did not. But perception and appearance is not the only thing that deceives us into authority bias. Our carefree reliance on the messages that we deem trustworthy is also to blame for this mental trap. We do not always have the time to verify the truth ourselves, and this is why we rely on shortcuts filtered from our past experiences, knowledge, and of course, authority to make up our minds. This is what we call heuristics, mental shortcuts that our brain tends to fall back when we process information. It is not that resorting to heuristics is a bad thing. Heuristics are cognitive shortcuts that allow us to rapidly take actions in our day-to-day lives. However, when situations get unpredictable and dangerous, relying on heuristics can exacerbate the problem at hand. This is what happened between NASA and Morton Thiokol, and this is what is highlighted in our thought experiment as well. Now, regardless of whether you fall for mental shortcuts in a pressure situation or not, your affinity towards authority and your tendency to take their words on face value is going to persist. That is because beyond the limitations of our mind, we are also limited by laziness and deferred responsibility. When we allow an authority figure to take the center stage, we can finally relax and be at peace, be it appointing the leader of a state or our inability to disconnect from our spouse or parent to be truly independent. For example, children who come from high-achieving parents often face high expectations. Their parents end up becoming much more than caretakers. They become their role models. Any conditioning coming from the parent is invariably accepted. That sort of obedience creates the groundwork for authority bias within such children. If the parents have high awareness, they can effectively diminish this tendency. However, on the flip side, if the parents happen to be dysfunctional or narcissistic, the tendency to bow to authority and remain silent becomes more emphasized within the children. Authority bias can be prevented by critical thinking and avoiding proximity. Literature says that when an individual is not at a close proximity to the authority figures, the bias does not play out with the same intensity. The idea of out of sight is out of mind seems to be relevant here. But if our tendency of staying silent depends on our proximity to the authority figure, it seems like authority bias is triggered by fear as much as it is triggered by lack of critical thinking. Perhaps it is both, and one leads to the other. Anybody who do not back their thoughts by critical thinking and yet verbalize it may invite harsh criticism or ridicule from authority figures. That moment can be enough to perpetuate fear and make you go silent. And that silence may in turn keep you out of public eye to slowly make you unaccountable without any need of challenging your assumptions or taking responsibility. There are so many instances in our daily lives where inaction and silence is the safest way to keep the peace. After all, who wants to disagree with the authority and risk getting fired? This is very common where authority figures have immediate control, such as school or workplace. On the other hand, authority bias coming from celebrities, famous people, and brands do not have the scope to trigger these fears. Instead, they rely on subtle details and nuances to make their message resonate on an emotional level. This takes a lot of intellectual capability that tends to shape opinions, motivations, and behaviors of people. Hence, fear plays a major role in the former case, but not in the latter. The latter is more about conditioning. So the next time you find yourself going quiet in a room where the loudest voice feels too polished to challenge, pause. Ask yourself, am I silent because I don't know what to say? Or am I silent because I have already decided that they must be right? Am I bogged down by the fear of consequences of what may happen? Are the choices and narratives of my liking really the truth? Or am I looking at them through the conditioning of following an authority? Remember that authority bias does not ask you to obey. It simply waits for your hesitation. But in that hesitation lies a choice: to surrender your critical voice or to speak with conviction, to silence your inner skeptic or to stop looking at things from rose-tinted glasses, to abandon your judgment or to reclaim the right to think for yourself. Please like, share, and subscribe if you loved the content.